embarking on a long-term project, building a collection of interviews, articles, and short fiction around the broad theme of speculating political futures. At this time in the world, it is tempting to retreat and defend what we can of past gains, but it is even more important now to think about building the future, and we must remember that without a positive future vision, we will lose even more in the present. At the same time, thinking about positive political futures is complex and requires a reevaluation of the present and the past. One arena of struggle in envisioning new futures, revisioning the past, and remaking the present is speculative fiction. The nature of the genre allows us as authors, readers, and activists to break the bonds of reactionary common sense and explore more radical and more open visions of the past, present, and future. The burgeoning diversity of perspectives that has long benefited the genre can open up new imaginative possibilities. Speculations from indigenous, colonized, or otherwise dominated populations can revision history to propose a better future. Speculations of new economic relationships and structures can break through the fetish of the market and offer new ways of living together and supplying our needs. Feminist and queer speculations can show us the possibilities of new forms of reproduction and a more egalitarian world. At the same time, these democratic future visions do not come without struggle. Revanchists are also fighting for their vision of the future, imagined worlds filled with expanded hierarchies of race, class, gender, and colonialism. This is the terrain that we find ourselves upon now, and our strength will lie with the breadth of possibility that our positive visions can provide. The resulting collection of this project hopes to consciously enter this terrain of struggle, challenging us as workers to envision and create new democratic futures. And we're delighted to welcome Jordan Carroll. Jordan received his PhD from the University of California, Davis. His most recent book is Speculative Whiteness, Science Fiction and the Alt-Right, and it's a finalist for this year's Hugo Award for Best Related Work, which I think it totally deserves to win. His first book, Reading the Obscene, Transgressive Editors and the Class Politics of U.S. Literature, won the MLA Prize for Independent Scholars. His writing has appeared in American literature, Post 45, The Nation, Polygon, Kaleidotrope, and the Los Angeles Review of Books. He works as a writer and educator in the Pacific Northwest. Jordan's work has been described as examining the issue of who has the right to write the future. This is an issue that is key in the struggles in the SF genre at the time, but it also reverberates throughout our contemporary politics. We're lucky to be speaking with Jordan today. Jordan, thank you so much for coming.
Thanks so much for having me.
It's a delight. I'm really looking forward. I've enjoyed the book. The first sentence of your book is really striking. It's a hook of hooks. You open with, the first major neo-Nazi party in the United States was led by a science fiction fan, James Madole. This seems so at odds with our sort of contemporary understanding sense about SF. Can you walk us through a little more about this history and the context?
Sure. So Madole was involved in two different communities during the 1940s. He was, on one hand, part of science fiction fandom, and on the other, he was very much engaged with Nazi supporters. And during this period, he tried to organize science fiction fans into a new political party. He put out an ad in a science fiction magazine and tried to find supporters. It seems like he was, for the most part, rebuffed. Like a lot of fan projects, it didn't seem to quite go anywhere. However, he took a lot of these science fiction sensibilities and incorporated them into his politics. He later became the head of the National Renaissance Party. And in that role, he presented a version of the future that combined, on one hand, white supremacy and fascism, and on the other hand, a kind of vision of a speculative future. So he believed that after the genocide, after the extermination of Jews and people of color in the United States, there would rise a totally pure ethno-state that he called the New Atlantis, and it would be ruled over by a technocratic elite of the most intelligent white men. And ultimately, he believed they would evolve into a new species, a kind of Homo superior. And these supermen, super white men, would ultimately uh, go off and colonize the stars. And so I think what this moment in history shows is that we often think about science fiction as progressive, as inherently on the left in some sense, but actually there has been a long history of fascists within the science fiction community. And we have to think instead of science fiction as a political struggle between left and right tendencies that has gone on for decades and decades. We can't think of fascist science fiction as something that emerges late with something like Gamergate or the Rabid Puppies. It's always been there within science fiction.
Yeah, sort of expanding on that, because I think, we read critics like Darko Suvin and Fred Jameson, and it may be a misreading of them, right? But we tend to bring out of their work the idea that science fiction is future oriented, and the future belongs to the left, right? We are the ones who look to the future, and hence, since science fiction is future oriented, it's ours. It's progressive, it's politically oriented in progressive frame. I think what's really interesting is your work is drawing out that the left doesn't have the only hold on the future, right? That fascism also, even though we've always characterized fascism as backward looking, reactionary, tied to blood and soil and origins, but your work is pointing out that fascism also has a future orientation. Can you expand on sort of that vision and how that reverberates in speculative fiction or science fiction?
Here it might be useful to distinguish between fascism and conservatism, although they obviously blur together at many different moments. Conservatism is about maintaining white supremacy and class domination within the present order, within the current legal and political structure. Whereas fascism is a revolutionary or insurrectionary movement that believes that white supremacy and other forms of domination cannot be upheld in the current system. And so they want to blow up the state or overthrow the state and start from year zero and imagine an entirely new world that is, again, dedicated to authoritarianism and racial domination. And so that is, in some ways, a modernist or modernizing vision. They're not just going back to the past, they want to invent a new future where the old social relations can persist and deepen. And so, in the post-war context, this often meant envisioning right-wing utopias and envisioning new white supremacist worlds. Frequently, they would draw on images from science fiction. So many fascist leaders would talk about uh, Nazi space colonization or genetic experiments that were devoted to creating a new master race. Um, so, in order to sell this radically different future, they had to draw upon fictional images of the future. Um, but it's important to note that even though we see a kind of leap into a different future, it always maintains some continuity with the past. And in particular, what the book argues is that even when fascists are talking about, inventing supercomputers or encasing the sun in a Dyson sphere, they still believe it's somehow rooted in blood and soil, rooted in primordial traditions. And they square the circle by arguing that the capacity to innovate and the capacity to imagine a very different future is something that only white men hold, that only white men are capable of making these enormous changes. Um, and so there's a tension within the alt-right and other fascist movements, a kind of forward-looking movement, but also an inability to think beyond white supremacy and other forms of domination.
Yeah, there's a really interesting way in which even some conservative movements, grab modern methods for reactionary, and historic looking goals, right? Even going back to someone like Burke,
Mhm,
right?
mhm.
We have this tension, and it's kind of one of the why reasons I loved seeing E.A. Ross come up in your work, right? That personally, it made me happy because it linked two sides of my rather schizophrenic scholarship, right? As a person who'd worked on history of science and now is interested in science fiction, you bringing E.A. Ross in made me feel like I'm not entirely crazy, or at least not alone, in looking at these two things together. But Ross, I think, encapsulates some of that tension, right? Both within science fiction and within politics, right? He's a towering figure in the progressive movement. He's quite willing to use modern, forward-thinking political work, but his goals are often quite retrograde, right? The sort of white state of the small town is his ideal. He's influential in the progressive movement. He's one of the main founders of U.S. sociology, but he's a deep racist advocate of eugenics and of Chinese and Japanese exclusion. He seems to me to be a character that sort of resonates with a lot of your analysis of speculative fiction and with the alt-right. Could you sort of expand on what you see as his relationship with speculative fiction?
So for Ross, I think that I was interested in his work on the racial dimensions, or what he saw as the racial dimensions of personality and psychology. And what he sums up for the purposes of the book is um, this idea that future orientation is mainly possessed by certain races, and especially white people. So he breaks this down into two components. One is he argues that some races are better at imagining, thinking about things that aren't in the here and now. And he also suggests that some races are better at self-discipline. And so he argues that some racialized populations are able to think about the future and then hold themselves to that plan, while other racialized populations aren't imaginative enough to think about how they might better themselves, or they are too impulsive to carry out those plans that might improve their lot. And I found that this was a running thread throughout a lot of scientific racism. And even beyond scientific racism, this is a myth that justifies um, uh, slavery and colonialism and other forms of anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism. And so the myth goes that white people are capable of saving and investing, of innovating and building towards something more. And then non-white people are stuck either in the past or in the present. Often this myth takes the form of a just so story about human evolution. Racists have often argued that white people evolved in the frozen north, and so they had to build storehouses of food and develop technologies like clothing and shelter, whereas non-white people, according to this myth, evolved in the tropical south, and so they would just allow fruit to fall into their hands and didn't have to worry about tomorrow. Anthropologists have debunked this myth again and again. Um, it's quite difficult, for example, to survive in the Kalahari Desert or the Australian outback or wherever without some kind of planning for the future. Um, but it's persistent because it allows racists to combine, on one hand, white supremacy but also modernity. And so it allows them to suggest that white people are the most modern, progressive, and forward-looking of races, and everyone else is left behind, either to be the subject of a kind of white paternalism, white people need to manage other populations, or a genocidal extermination.
Yeah, and it's such a powerful trope, and it keeps seeming to return in one, in one strain or another. This sort of false sense of evolution with some kind of a teleology, or this idea of geographical determinism. I love the fact that you bring up the fact that J. Philip Rushton is still, brought it back up again. In one way or another, Jared Diamond brings it back up again. It just doesn't seem to sort of go away. And it does seem to be a fair amount of sort of golden age space opera. It seems to really haunt that era of science fiction. And now that sort of tie into the science that is out and about and popular during the development of science fiction is one of the things that drew me to your work. And the way that these sort of racialized applications of science really fixed the sort of fascist imagination, and the way that those racial sciences then inform not just the fascist imagination, but sort of an a larger sort of common sense, right? When we take a look at the Chicago World's Fair, and it is set up as you walk up the midway to be the ascent of races, right? Native Americans, Africans, Pacific Islanders, Asians, and of course the white city. How perfect, as sort of the 19th century race science that, is around when Wells is writing, H.G., or these various people. One of the things that has always interested me in 19th century science is the way that gender and race are so closely knitted together in the scientific imagination, right? Emile Durkheim, working off of Gustave Le Bon's work, writes that the advanced races are marked not just by larger brains in men, but by smaller brains in women, right? Smarter men, dumber women is how you measure racial advance. And this sort of male supremacy, along with white supremacy, seems to be a really important theme in your book. Do you see this sort of sexism and sexual hierarchy in the fascist movements you're looking at today? And how does that get played out in speculative fiction, and by whom?
Yeah, I mean, we definitely see male supremacy throughout fascism. It's, I think, central to fascism. And one of the things that I've found is that fascist thinkers like Richard Spencer really do look towards science fiction as a way of reasserting masculinity. So in Spencer's podcasts, he often will talk about the ways that uh, space can become a way for men to reclaim their tough masculinity. So he imagines masculinity to be all about risk taking, and in particular, kind of entrepreneurial risk, a willingness to potentially lay down one's life for something greater. And he sees space exploration as opening up a new frontier where men can go off into space and to potentially die in order to further his vision of civilizational progress. And this is going to kind of toughen them up. Whereas right now, somebody like Spencer believes that men are too emasculated, they're too consumerist, they're too interested in short-term pleasures. He wants a program of shared sacrifice and ultimately death, willingness to die for something greater, as a way of having men return to their manhood. Um, obviously, like this is a very convenient myth for these fascists to believe that they all lead fairly comfortable lives. So it's very easy for them to fantasize about going off into space and becoming sort of rugged Teddy Roosevelt figures among the stars.
Yeah, I do. That irony is is so poignant, right? And that frontier mythology and the frontier as the machine of making the citizen, right, is also drawn from, E.A. Ross's colleague at Wisconsin, Frederick Jackson Turner, right, who writes on the closing of the frontier, and that the frontier was what turned Europeans into Americans, and it was the family structure, right? It's the isolated cabin in the woods with man, mother and children, right? So there's this. It's amazing to think about these relationships and ties to settler colonialism, right? And that's one of the things Ursula K. Le Guin talks about often is to talk about that sort of space opera as a recreation of the colonial adventure story, right? That we get out of the British literature tradition, the British young adult tradition. And you mentioned Teddy Roosevelt, right, who uses the science fiction time travel metaphor to talk about his safari back into Africa. That it is a journey into the Pleistocene. And it's unquestioned, right? That, he publishes that in his safari notebook. How, building out, how does the larger sort of history of colonialism and the colonialist myths sort of fit with what you're looking at in terms of science fiction?
John Ryder has an excellent book called Colonialism and the Emergence of Science Fiction that I rely pretty heavily on, and I think everybody should read who's interested in these topics. But he argues, and as you pointed out, with how this logic operates in a number of places, that um, colonizers imagined history as a series of stages in development and civilization. And they imagined that Europeans were the latest stage of development, whereas other societies, in particularly colonized societies, represented throwbacks to the past. They hadn't quite caught up with the present. And so the colonial encounter was often imagined as you point out, like a form of time travel. People from the present or the future, white people encountering colonized people from the past. And within science fiction, authors like H.G. Wells began to think about this idea and kind of critique it. For Wells, he's imagining what if a civilization that is more technologically advanced, say on Mars, comes down and colonizes white Europeans? Would we think of that as the inevitable march of history, or would we see that as an atrocity, as something horrific? And so we can see that colonialism often operates in science fiction as an object of critique, and science fiction often serves as a way of estranging colonialism so that we can rethink it and ultimately reject it and find solidarity with colonized peoples. Um, Within fascist circles, though, that they don't have those kinds of critiques. Um, we see fascists openly embracing this idea that white people are the future and non-white people are the past that have to be superseded. Um, and we also see an interest in colonization. The fascists believe that there is an innate drive in white people to expand and colonize and conquer, but they're also always worried that colonialism um, necessarily results in what they see as race mixing and racial contamination. So space comes in then as a way for them to imagine colonization without a colonized or colonization without indigenous populations. They like the idea of expanding outwards into space and conquering the stars, but never having to actually encounter another human being or anyone who's different from them. And indeed, like strangely, so many of these fantasies that we see in fascist circles really don't involve some kind of other out in space. It is about the self-assertion of white men as they plant their flags on other planets.
Yeah, a safe frontier, safe
Mhm.
from sexual temptation frontier.
Yes.
I mean, I think that's really, really interesting. Again, that sort of the frontier is not a place of mixing, right? But a purity sort of
Yeah.
test. The fear of that kind of impurity that might arise as a danger in the frontier. Um, Yeah, Anindita Banerjee has a book, We Modern People, where she makes the case that the centers of science fiction develop in places with an advanced metropole and a sort of hinterland that the metropole is moving out into, right? So England and its colonies, France and its colonies, Russia and Siberia, the United States and the West, and that this colonial time travel is so key to that. And I love the idea of connecting that into the frontier and the way space is a safer frontier because you're not tempted by the natives.
Mhm.
What a perfect fascist kind of imagination to dig out.
Yeah, Spencer even imagines the friend like space is just a mirror. It's just the white men looking at themselves in space. So yeah, it's perfectly safe and perfectly self-contained for him.
Yeah, I think you say something about his adoption of the Tarkovsky Solaris.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a total misreading of a text that is really about like this and the novel as well as an encounter with something totally other that we can't understand. But for him, he effaces that and just white people encountering themselves and that's it.
Yeah, Solaris as a narcissistic mirror is just sort of unbelievable as opposed to the we can't actually engage and understand the other because we haven't actually looked at ourselves yet, which is the Tarkovsky and Lem sort of point. I was stunned by that, the ability of Spencer to reread Solaris in that narcissistic central frame when Solaris is so about decentering the subjectivity of humans. But thinking about sort of humans who have centered subjectivities, right? And one of the amazing aspects at the moment is the popularization of science fiction among the broligarchy, right? The tech broligarchs. And I would love to sort of think about them and science fiction and the alt-right, right? Tech billionaires who are identifying with speculative fiction, right? Peter Thiel, who names Palantir after, a Tolkien piece. Bezos' horrific wedding in Venice has just happened, right? With an 8-foot model of the Enterprise in his Blue Origin, entryway. And Elon Musk, who claims to be an Ian Banks fan. Banks, a left-wing supporter of the left wing of the Labour movement, of the Labour Party in England forever, would be rolling in his grave if Elon, if he, with Elon Musk's adoration. Can you sort of talk through how do they read and take science fiction, and is part of what they're drawing from this sort of alt-right wellspring?
I think that they're related, and in some ways they're analogous. So one of the things that I argue in the book is that the alt-right is motivated by an idea of this lost future. They imagine themselves to have this hidden potential that isn't realized because of multicultural and multiracial society, because of a conspiracy against white men, essentially, is what they think. What actually happened was, these are often millennials who experienced the social turmoil surrounding the financial crisis, or in some cases, these are just self-sabotaging individuals who, seemed promising and then went off the rails at a certain point in their life. But they're all kind of motivated by this idea that there was a future that they were supposed to realize that didn't happen because of this nefarious other that has prevented them from becoming who they are. Um, with the techno-fascists, it's very different. Like, I don't think that Bezos or Thiel or Musk can um, really think that they have not realized their wildest, at least financial dreams right now. But they still think that the future isn't what they had hoped it to be. We're living in a moment of economic stagnation, and they had hoped the economy to grow faster. They had hoped for inventions that haven't happened yet. Peter Thiel will often sort of ask, "Where's my flying car?" And for them, they think that this glorious future of rapid economic growth and technological innovation has been stolen by the masses, by democracy, by the welfare state or the regulatory state, but also by a consumerist orientation. Tech companies are making gadgets for a quick profit instead of building, spaceships to go to Mars or some other grand design. And so I think what the techno-fascists want is a strong sovereign who is able to hold back the masses, to deny their democratic demands in order to build something greater and realize a grander destiny than just creating more apps for people's phones, essentially. I think this is also a material project. It's not just an ideological one. They really do want the state to direct resources into R&D, into their projects in particular. And so they're coming up with an ideological cover for funneling more taxpayer money into the coffers of people like Musk and Thiel.
Yeah. Yeah, it does. It certainly doesn't seem like Musk had any of his grant money, or any of his funding in the Doge piece. And I think that, I think there's an aspect of that sort of that ties into what you've just said, right? Here we have Musk, proudly feeding USAID into the wood chipper, right? Which, is already resulting in a spiking death rate in Africa, HIV, impure water, food. I mean, but that does not, that's not at all on Musk's agenda, despite Musk claiming that we need more people, right? This sort of pro-natalism that we've seen come back, particularly on this sort of alt-right. Musk seems intent on populating Mars with his own children, and, his whole idea that we should be on Mars already, right, as the Musk project that he wants this state funding for. And I think that we have science fiction has had a tradition of anxiety about overpopulation, but there's also a strong eugenic tradition, I think, in science fiction, right, in stories like The Marching Morons. How do you analyze these sort of trends around, population, reproduction, and resources, and who gets resources and who doesn't in this sort of tech vision of science fiction? I feel like I've just mushed my point there, but maybe you can draw something out of that question.
I think for Musk, his vision of the future is that innovation and change all come from smart people. And then if you want more innovation and change, you need to maximize the number of smart people. And so it's a very kind of crude populationist, if that's a word, idea of the future. an idea, I guess pronatalist would be a better phrase, better term, um, where, we need to make sure that smart people breed more and that the unintelligent masses are kept in check. And ultimately, this is part of his vision of space colonization. Like, yeah, as you point out, like Mars is there to enable smart people to have more babies, claim more space, and this will be a kind of feedback loop where more smart people result in more inventions, result in more smart people. So it's a simplistic vision of the future. Um, Musk is a reader of science fiction, but not always a good reader of science fiction. Um, but it's also a vision of the future that is very anti-democratic. He believes that the future will be created by the elites and everybody else is along for the ride. And it's one that is very contemptuous of most people on the planet. I mean, for him, the masses are represented by idiocracy, which is a kind of retelling of the marching moron story. He sees most people as NPCs or drones, basically, who are exist only to be props in the success stories of people like himself. And there's, as you suggest, a eugenic dimension to this. He's very much interested in um, making sure that his bloodline not only persists down through the ages, but also that he is the father of as many children as possible. So there is a kind of anxiety about birth rates um, and about particularly the birth rates of educated, supposedly smart individuals.
Yeah, it strikes me in terms of future predictions of the past, right? Peter Thiel may want his flying car. Musk may want his Mars colony. As a worker, I wonder where's my 15-hour work week, right? That Keynes promised me 70, 80 years ago. We were supposed to have this um, perspective. I really like the passage in your book, quote, toward the end. Speculative whiteness will always remain self-imprisoned in a racist solipsism that prevents it from imagining anything outside or after itself. Once more, the alt-right promises a bold new future in space, but it never achieves escape velocity from white supremacy's perpetual present. Right? And I think what you're pointing to is Musk's idea of what a Mars colony is going to look like looks a lot like what Musk thinks should be the status quo now, right? There's no other here, again, like the Spencer and Tarkovsky. I think this is getting at, aspects of how do we think about writing our science fiction texts? How do we think about teaching our science fiction texts to sort of evade that Richard Spencer simplistic capture of a text to turn it into a piece of fascist outreach? And sort of how do you think about what speculative whiteness is in this regard? I think those, those things go together, and I think are important to readers understanding your work.
So, speculative whiteness is a number of different related ideologies or ideas, part of the same sort of complex. One is that white people, and especially straight white men, um, have a monopoly on imagination. It also suggests that other people don't have that same capacity for imagination. Um, and as a result, the people who hold this idea believe that science fiction is inherently white and that even like a technological future is also inherently white. And they believe that only in that high-tech future, a kind of fascist utopia, will white men be able to realize their full potentials. And as you point out, like the book suggests that this is in some ways like a self-defeating idea. They imagine that there's going to be some radical shift, a rupture with the present, and yet they can't imagine a world in which the current social relations don't obtain. They can't imagine a world after capitalism or after white supremacy. They believe that the current inequalities will persist down through the ages, and we even have um, uh, fantasies of a post-human future that is still somehow white supremacist. So they're unable to um, sort of dream anything beyond that. But I think that progressive science fiction or left-wing science fiction can kind of provide an antidote to that. I mean, we have so many great anti-fascist science fiction texts, Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower, or Terry Bisson's Fire on the Mountain. Um, but also, I think that one antidote to um, fascist science fiction is also queer literature. I somewhat facetiously put forward Chuck Tingle as, maybe not facetiously, as somewhat tongue-in-cheek described Chuck Tingle, the queer erotica author, as an anti-fascist. Um, and I think that authors like Samuel Delany, with Stars in My Pockets Like Grains of Sand, from that longer tradition of queer thought and literature, can also provide an antidote to fascism, because what they envision is a future that embraces hybridity and impurity, a future that's not about stable identities, a future that's radically different from the present, and not just sort of taking our own system of domination and adding jetpacks and Martian colonies to it. They imagine a future where the coordinates through which we understand the world will be radically different. The identities that we currently hold are going to shift and change. And they imagine a world that isn't about simply seeing the future as a realization of a potential of elites in the present, but a future as something that we all build together and shape based on our desires and wishes.
Yeah, I'm sort of thrilled to hear you bring that up, because that was one of the things that sort of was floating in the back of my mind as I was reading the book, thinking, is there a way that the really burgeoning queer SF community provides us with some kind of resistance to the fascism drive to purity, right? I mean, authors like Nino Chipri, who wrote Fina and Defect, a marvelous, reformulation of the IKEA store in wonderfully queer, aspects. Or, and it makes me think of Stuart Hall, who calls us to embrace impurity, right, as a strategy for moving forward. And of course, Delaney, and I think there's an aspect here in which, Delaney and the city provides, an alternative to Spencer and the pure pastoral, right? Mm-hmm. That I think that, perhaps moving forward, embracing that sort of queer impurity, whether it's sexual or not, but the impurity of the relationship with the other is what I think Hall is calling us. Always bring a bit of the other into yourself, right, as a way to resist fascism. I really don't want to just sort of talk about the negative aspects of SF, and we've moved to sort of positive thoughts about the genre. And I think, you're pointing to a lot of writers who are using speculative fiction, science fiction. The genre is even becoming more impure with writers like Jeff Vandermeer and N.K. Jemisin, right? I think the genre is embracing a certain hybridity and impurity as it's moving forward. And I think about people like Victor Lavallee and P. Jelly Clark and N.K. Jemisin, of course, Rebecca Roanhorse and Indigenous Futurism, Priya Sharma, South Asian Futurisms. Who are some of the people that you see who might be embracing and promoting an anti-fascist SF vision?
Yeah, I mean, I think that many of the authors that you have mentioned, I think, are great examples. I mean, all of them are great examples of anti-fascist authors. Um, but yeah, I mean, I think that for me, it is that vision of an impure future that I think that we should reach out towards. Like I said, I think that Delaney, I think, is an excellent example of this. I would add. Um, Silvia Morena Garcia's Mexican Gothic as another example of a great anti-fascist text that is fighting against this idea of bloodlines and purity and seeing the future as simply as a replica of the past and heritage. We also have a long tradition of um, anti-fascist critiques that are satirical and parodic. Norman Spinrad's The Iron Dream is something that's come up a lot in this project, and just pointing out the kind of ridiculousness of this vision of the Ubermensch going off into the stars and the way that it is so obviously a kind of wish fulfillment for adolescent boys who have not moved beyond seeing the world as something that they are going to dominate and destroy. So yeah, I think that we're in a moment where we're seeing so many different traditions that are responding to this either directly or indirectly in the science fiction community.
Yeah, I loved your shout out to Terry Bisson, who's an amazing, was an amazing anti-fascist author. I loved his short story, The Left Left Behind. After the rapture, when all those Christians go up to heaven, we can manage Earth much better on our own. Thank you very much. Right? I mean, it's a beautiful sort of parody that fills one with some hope. Right. I would love to close with sort of your suggested, a reading list for folks, and both positive and negative. Right? Who do you see if folks want to sort of explore? What have been some of the fascist dimensions in the genre historically, who to look at, and then again what we've just been talking about. Who are the places you would encourage people to start reading for some anti-fascist SF? Where should people start?
In terms of understanding the history of fascism, for me, David Higgins's Reverse Colonization was, I think, an important book for this project. I also found Alexandra Minna Stern's book, Proud Boys in the White Ethnostate, to be especially useful. A recent book that I read that was particularly illuminating for me was Quinn Slobodian's book, Hayek's Bastards, which is a book about the relationship between libertarianism and the far right, which have often been thought as somehow separate, but actually are deeply embedded with one another. Um, but in terms of anti-fascist science fiction, I mean, I think we're reaching a moment in which there's it seems like the left is kind of um, uh, back in control of the science fiction field. I mean, I think it's so much of what we see now is anti-fascist. We're kind of leaving behind the rabid puppies and the sad puppies and the old fantasies about white men going off and conquering the stars. So I mean, I feel like at this point, most of the science fiction that you see out there that's gaining critical acclaim right now is either explicitly or implicitly taking an anti-fascist position.
Yeah, that's a nice hopeful note to end on, right? There's movement in the field.